The sun clung heavy in the late afternoon sky, casting long shadows across the plains that stretched endlessly around the little cabin Clara called home. The land was dry, worn from weeks without rain, and every step sent tiny clouds of dust spiraling into the air. Clara, a small girl of only 8 years, walked barefoot along the trail that wound between the cabin and the creek. She carried a wooden pail, her thin arms straining with the task, though she never complained. Life had taught her early that complaints carried little weight in a world that listened only to strength. Her family was poor, poorer than most of the other settlers scattered across the prairie. Their crops were meager, their animals few, and their cabin leaned with the wear of too many storms. Clara's dresses were patched with scraps of fabric, her shoes long since fallen apart, yet she bore it all with quiet endurance. Though her body was small and frail, her heart carried a strength that many grown folk lacked. It was on this dusty trail that Clara first saw him. At first, she thought it was a trick of the heat, just a figure wavering in the shimmering air. But as she drew closer, she realized it was a boy, no older than herself, struggling to walk. His steps were uneven, and each time his foot struck the ground, his face twisted in pain. He leaned heavily on a broken branch he had fashioned into a crude crutch, his small frame trembling with each effort forward. Clara's breath caught. He was unlike anyone she had seen up close before. His dark hair hung in loose strands over his forehead, his skin tanned and sun-browned, and his clothes, simple buckskin, worn and torn, marked him as native. Among the settlers, there were whispers and warnings about the tribes, that they were dangerous, that a child like her should never cross paths with one. Yet looking at him, Clara did not see danger. She saw a child hurt and alone. The boy's moccasin was torn at the side, and beneath it his foot was bloodied, scraped raw from walking too far without care. Every step he took sent streaks of red into the dust, leaving a trail behind him. He stopped when he noticed Clara, his eyes sharp and guarded. They were dark eyes, filled with suspicion, but also fear. Fear not of her, but of what might happen if he trusted her. For a moment they simply stared at each other, two children from different worlds, bound by the silence of the prairie. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She knew what her father would say if he saw her standing here. Keep away. Trouble will follow him. And perhaps he would be right. Perhaps the boy carried danger with him. But Clara couldn't bring herself to turn away. Hello, she whispered, her voice trembling as softly as the wind. She took a careful step forward, clutching her pail against her chest. The boy didn't answer. He shifted uncomfortably, his weight pressing harder on his makeshift crutch, his foot dragging slightly behind him. Clara noticed how pale he looked, beneath the dirt, how his lips pressed tight to keep from crying out. He was close to collapsing, she realized. Clara hesitated only a second before she set her pail down and crouched. She tore a strip of cloth from the hem of her dress, a piece she had mended so many times it barely held together. Holding it out in her small hand, she gestured toward his foot. "I can help," she said, though she knew he might not understand. Her words. The boy's eyes darted to her hand, then to her face. Suspicion lingered, but exhaustion was stronger. Slowly, he lowered himself to sit on a nearby rock. Clara crept closer, her heart racing, and gently lifted his torn moccasin. The wound was angry and red, dirt clinging to the raw skin. With tender hands, she wrapped the strip of cloth around it, tying it as best she could. The boy winced but did not pull away. When she finished, he looked at her again, really looked at her. The suspicion in his eyes softened, if only slightly. "What's your name?" Clara asked, though she didn't expect an answer. For a long time, he was silent. Then, in a voice no louder than a whisper, he said, "Tayan." Clara smiled. It was the first step between them, a fragile bridge across a wide chasm. She helped him to his feet, steadying him when he faltered. His weight was heavy against her small frame, but she didn't let go. Together, step by step, they turned back toward her family's cabin, leaving the dusty road behind. Clara knew trouble might follow. She knew her parents might scold her, even fear what she had done. But in her heart, she also knew she could not have left him there. For in that moment, on that dusty road, compassion outweighed fear. And though she did not yet realize it, that single act of kindness would change her life forever. Clara's arms trembled as she helped Tayan toward the cabin. He leaned heavily on her shoulder, his crutch dragging awkwardly in the dirt. Each step felt like a mountain to him, and though she was small and frail, Clara bore his weight with quiet determination. She had never carried so much responsibility before, not in the physical sense, nor in the sense of consequence. In her heart, she knew she was making a choice that could bring trouble. Still, she pressed on. The cabin came into view at the edge of the prairie clearing. Smoke drifted lazily from the crooked chimney, and the sound of a chicken clucking nearby broke the still air. Clara hesitated as they drew near. How would her mother react? Her father was away working a neighbor's field that day, but her mother had always been cautious, wary of strangers. Clara worried her mother's fear would overcome her compassion. Tayan's hand tightened on her shoulder. His steps faltered, and he whispered something in his own tongue, his voice soft with uncertainty. Clara didn't understand his words, but she understood his meaning. He was afraid too. She turned to him with a small, reassuring smile, though inside her stomach twisted with worry. "Don't be scared," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I'll make her see." The cabin door creaked open just as they reached the steps. Her mother stood in the doorway, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. At first, she smiled at the sight of her daughter returning, but her face hardened when she saw the boy beside her. Her hands froze mid-motion, her eyes narrowing. "Clara," she said slowly, her voice low and heavy. "What have you brought? Here?" Clara swallowed, her heart pounding. She tightened her grip on Tayan's arm, as if afraid her mother might chase him off. "He's hurt," she said quickly. "His foot, it's bad. He can't walk far. I found him on the road." Her mother's eyes flicked to the boy's torn moccasin, to the makeshift bandage wrapped clumsily in strips of Clara's dress. Her face softened for a brief second, then hardened again, her fear returning. "Clara, you don't understand," she whispered sharply. "If he's here, then others may be close. His people—" "Please, Mama," Clara interrupted, her voice rising with urgency. "He's just a child, my age. Look at him." She pulled Tayan forward gently, showing his pale face, the sweat on his brow, the way he trembled from weakness. "Does this look like someone who's here to hurt us?" Her mother's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked at Clara, at her determined eyes that rarely held such fire, and she hesitated. Clara knew her mother's heart was not unkind, only fearful, worn down by years of whispered warnings and stories of raids and danger. But for the first time, Clara felt stronger than her mother's fear. "Please," she whispered again. "Just let him rest. Just for tonight." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind against the cabin walls. Tayan stood silently, watching, his eyes darting between the two women as though his fate balanced on a knife's edge. Finally, her mother sighed, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Bring him inside," she said at last, her tone resigned but not unkind. "But only for tonight." Relief washed over Clara so quickly she nearly cried. She guided Tayan into the cabin, helping him onto the small wooden bench by the hearth. Her mother fetched a basin of water and a rag, her movements brisk but careful. Clara knelt beside him, holding his hand as if to promise he was safe. When her mother began to clean the wound properly, Tayan winced and flinched, his small fingers clutching Clara's tighter. Clara leaned close, whispering, "It's all right. She won't hurt you." And for the first time, she saw trust flicker in his eyes. Later, as the evening shadows lengthened, her mother cut a slice of the coarse bread they had baked that morning. Food was scarce, every meal mattered, but she placed a piece on a wooden plate and set it before the boy. Clara watched as Tayan hesitated, then took it with quiet gratitude, breaking it into small bites. Clara's chest swelled with pride. She had done it. She had stood her ground even against her mother's fear. She had chosen compassion, and her mother, hesitant though she was, had followed. When the cabin grew quiet that night and the fire crackled low, Clara lay on her straw bed, staring at the low ceiling above. She thought of the boy asleep near the hearth, his breathing steady now. She thought of the risk they had taken. Her mother's voice drifted softly across the room. "Clara, sometimes kindness carries weight you cannot see. I pray you've not invited danger upon us." Clara's eyes fluttered shut. Her small hand curled against her chest. She whispered only to herself, "It was the right thing to do." She did not know yet how right or how dangerous her choice would prove to be. The morning light poured softly through the cracks in the cabin walls, painting slivers of gold across the wooden floor. Clara stirred from her bed of straw, rubbing her eyes with the back of her hand. The faint smell of smoke from the dying fire lingered, mingling with the scent of fresh earth carried in through the open window. She sat up slowly, her gaze drifting to the hearth. Tayan was there, curled beneath the old quilt her mother had reluctantly laid over him. He still looked fragile, his face pale and drawn, but there was color returning to his cheeks. His foot, now cleaned and wrapped in fresh cloth, rested on a small stool. For a moment, Clara simply watched him sleep. He was different from anyone she had ever known. Yet when she saw him like this, he didn't feel like a stranger at all. He looked only like a child who had walked too far, carried too much, and finally found rest. Clara crept toward the hearth, her small feet silent against the wooden floor. She knelt beside him, studying his features in the quiet morning. His hair fell loosely across his brow, his lashes long against his skin. He stirred suddenly, his eyes fluttering open, and Clara froze. For a moment there was fear in his eyes, wild, sharp, like an animal startled awake. But then recognition softened them, and he blinked at her with a weariness that was not unkind. Clara smiled timidly. "Good morning," she whispered. Tayan said nothing, only watched her, his lips pressed, in a thin line. Clara frowned, realizing he might not understand her words. She tapped her chest lightly and said, "Clara." Then, pointing to him, she tilted her head expectantly. It took a long pause before he answered. "Tayan," he murmured, his voice low and uncertain. Clara beamed, repeating softly, "Tayan." She said it again, slower, letting the syllables roll off her tongue as if memorizing it. He nodded, as though approving her effort. Their conversation was simple, filled with gestures more than words. Clara tried to ask him where he had come from, tracing shapes in the air with her hands, but he only shook his head, his expression guarded. She didn't push him. Instead, she reached for the loaf of bread left on the table. Breaking it in half, she offered the larger piece to him. At first, Tayan hesitated. He glanced toward her mother, who was busy kneading dough near the counter, her eyes flicking toward them with quiet watchfulness. Clara pushed the bread closer, her small hand insistent. Finally, he took it, bowing his head slightly in gratitude. He ate slowly, his movements careful, as though each bite had to be savored. Clara nibbled on her piece, sitting close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. When the bread was gone, Clara hummed softly to herself, an old lullaby her grandmother once sang. The melody was simple, rising and falling like the sway of grass in the wind. She hadn't sung it in a long time, but somehow it felt right here, in the quiet of the cabin. Tayan tilted his head, listening, his eyes half closed. For the first time, Clara saw the corners of his mouth curve into the smallest of smiles. It was a fragile smile, the kind that could vanish in an instant, but to Clara it felt like a gift. As the day wore on, Clara showed him little things around the cabin. Her favorite cup carved by her father, the old doll made from cloth and straw, the stack of firewood she had helped gather. He didn't speak much, but he watched with careful eyes, sometimes nodding, sometimes touching the objects as though memorizing them. When the evening sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the clearing, Clara and Tayan sat together near the doorway. They didn't need words. Clara drew shapes in the dust with a stick, and Tayan added his own beside hers. She sketched a crude flower. He drew a bird in flight. She laughed, clapping her hands softly, and he looked at her with a mixture of confusion and curiosity as though surprised by her delight. That night, when the fire burned low again, Clara's mother whispered to her, "Child, don't get too close. He is not like us." But Clara, lying with her eyes on the flickering flames, whispered back, "He's just a boy, Mama, just like me." Her mother said nothing more, though Clara noticed her gaze lingered longer on Tayan before she finally turned to bed. In the quiet that followed, Clara hummed her lullaby once more. Tayan, half asleep, turned his head toward the sound. His lips moved, faintly forming a word she didn't know. Clara closed her eyes, her small hand resting near his. She didn't need to understand. What mattered was the trust slowly taking root between them, as fragile as a seed in dry soil, yet alive. In that stillness, a bond was being born, one neither of them could yet comprehend. And though neither child knew it, this quiet bond would soon echo far beyond the cabin walls. The prairie nights were always restless. The wind slipped through the cracks in the cabin walls, carrying the faint cries of coyotes in the distance, and the floor creaked as though it shared in the unease. Clara lay awake on her narrow bed of straw, her small blanket pulled tight to her chin. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows that shifted across the wooden walls like ghostly hands. Tayan slept near the hearth, his foot still bandaged, his breathing slow but uneven. From time to time he stirred, murmuring, words in his own tongue, fragments of dreams she could not understand. Clara rolled onto her side, her eyes fixed on him. He was safe here, she told herself. She had done the right thing. Yet the thought did not quiet the storm inside her. She knew the stories settlers told, stories whispered by firelight with voices, lowered as though fear itself could overhear, of raids, of cabins burned, of families vanishing into the night. The adults always spoke of the tribes as if they were shadows that lingered just beyond the tall grass, waiting, watching. Clara had never seen such things with her own eyes, but she had seen the fear in her mother's face. And tonight, that same fear weighed heavy on her. What if his people came looking for him? What if they found him here under her family's roof? Would they see her kindness, or would they see it as theft, as though she had taken one of their own? Clara squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her face into her pillow. She wanted to believe that helping him was enough, that kindness could not be punished. But her father's words echoed in her memory. The world is hard, Clara, and it does not always reward good hearts. She turned back toward the hearth, watching the rise and fall of Tayan's chest. He was just a boy, thin, small, no stronger than she was. The idea that someone could see him as a threat felt impossible, and yet in the stillness of the night she could not shake the image of riders cresting the horizon, their eyes hard, their weapons ready. Clara's small hand curled into a fist beneath her blanket. She whispered into the darkness, as though the words themselves could shield them. "It's all right. I'll keep you safe." Her mother stirred on the other side of the cabin. "Clara," came her voice, low and weary. "Why are you still awake?" "I can't sleep," Clara admitted softly. There was a pause, the kind that held both exhaustion and truth. "Neither can I," her mother whispered back. Then, after another silence, "Child, sometimes kindness brings burdens heavier than cruelty. Do you understand?" Clara thought for a long moment. Her chest ached with the weight of it. "Maybe," she said finally, "but I think kindness is worth carrying." Her mother sighed, not in disapproval, but in sorrow, as though she wished her daughter's words could be enough to make the world gentler. The cabin grew quiet again. The fire dimmed lower still, leaving only the faint glow of embers. Clara drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, her dreams filled with images of warriors at the door, of Tyan's hand slipping from hers, of flames swallowing their home. She woke. Before dawn, her heart racing, but the cabin was still intact, the world outside still silent. She rose quietly and tiptoed to the hearth. Tyan's eyes fluttered open at the sound, and for a moment their gazes met in the pale light of morning. He looked weary, but calmer, as though he sensed her worry. Slowly, he raised his small hand and pressed it to his chest, then stretched it toward her. Clara didn't know the meaning of the gesture, but something in it soothed her heart. She mirrored him, placing her hand on her chest, and then toward him. For the first time since she had found him, Tyan's lips curved into a faint smile. It was small, fleeting, but it told her something her fears could not erase. He trusted her. And, in that moment, Clara knew she could bear the weight of her choice. Even if her kindness brought danger, even if the burden grew heavy, she would carry it. For no child deserved to be left limping and alone on a dusty road. What she could not know, what neither child could yet see, was that the burden she had chosen to carry would soon call forth a response far larger than she ever imagined. The morning sun crept slowly over the horizon, turning the prairie grass into fields of gold. Clara rose earlier than usual, driven not by chores, but by the restless unease that had kept her half awake through the night. Her little feet carried her outside the cabin door, where the air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of dew and dust. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The chickens pecked lazily in the yard, the wind shifted gently through the tall grass, and the sky stretched, wide and cloudless. But then Clara saw it. Shallow marks in the earth, cutting across the clearing near the edge of the trees. They weren't there yesterday. She crouched down, brushing her small hand across the ground. The prints were not from their old mule, nor from her father's boots. They were larger, deeper, horse tracks pressed into the soil, a cluster of them. Her chest tightened. Behind her, the cabin door creaked open, and her mother stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. She followed Clara's gaze to the tracks, her face stiffening. "Inside," her mother whispered firmly. "But Mama," Clara began. "Now." The sharpness in her mother's tone left no room for argument. Clara rose reluctantly, her eyes darting once more to the tree line before she hurried inside. Tyan was awake, sitting upright on the bench near the hearth. He held himself stiffly as though he already knew what Clara had seen. His dark eyes shifted from her mother's face to Clara's, reading them both with quiet understanding. Clara sat beside him. "Someone was here," she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded, tapping 2 fingers lightly against his chest before motioning toward the door. She didn't know his words, but she understood his meaning. "My people." Her mother busied herself at the counter, kneading bread with hands that moved too quickly, too forcefully. It doesn't matter whose people they were, she muttered. If they saw tracks leading here, if they know we've sheltered him... She cut herself off, her jaw tightening. Clara swallowed hard. She looked at Tyan's bandaged foot, then at the fear etched across her mother's face. The weight of her choice settled heavier on her shoulders than ever before. The rest of the day passed in an uneasy haze. Clara tried to distract herself with chores, fetching water, sweeping the floor, gathering eggs, but every sound seemed sharper, every shift of the wind more threatening. When the chickens clucked too loudly, she jumped. When the mule brayed from the pen, she startled. The prairie, usually her playground, now felt like a wide, empty stage with unseen eyes watching from the wings. That evening, as the sun sank low and shadows stretched long across the clearing, Clara's father returned. Dust clung to his boots and hat, and his face was weary from labor. But when he saw the extra set of moccasins by the door, his eyes narrowed. "What's this?" he demanded, his voice firm. Her mother hesitated. Clara, her heart pounding, spoke quickly. "I found him on the road, Papa. He was hurt. He couldn't walk. I had to help." Her father's gaze flicked to Tyan, who stood quietly in the corner, watching. His face darkened, not with cruelty, but with fear. He set his tools down hard on the table. "Clara," he said slowly, "do you know what you've done?" Tears pricked at her eyes. She wanted to explain, to tell him she couldn't just leave the boy there alone and bleeding. But her father didn't wait for her words. He stepped outside, scanning the horizon, his posture tense. That night, the family ate in silence. Tyan took only a little food, as though he didn't want to take more than he was owed. Clara sat close to him, chewing, slowly her mind racing. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind outside, felt like a warning. When the fire had burned low, Clara lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling once more. She wanted to believe the world was still safe, that the tracks meant nothing, that no one would come, but she could not shake the image of hooves pounding across the prairie, of riders appearing at their door. As she drifted toward uneasy sleep, Tyan's soft voice reached her from the hearth. He spoke in his own tongue, words she could not understand. But the tone, gentle, almost like a prayer, soothed her. Clara clutched her blanket tighter. For the first time since finding him, she realized the truth. Her kindness had bound her fate to his. If danger came, it would come for them both. And outside, beneath the silver light of the moon, the prairie seemed to hold its breath. The morning broke with an uneasy stillness. Even the prairie seemed to sense what lingered beyond the horizon. Clara rose from her straw bed and peeked out the small window, her heart thudding against her ribs. The world outside looked ordinary. The chickens scratched in the yard, the mule swished its tail, and the grass bent in waves under the steady breeze. Yet something about the air felt different, heavy, as if waiting. Her father was already outside, crouched near the edge of the clearing. He studied the horse tracks Clara had noticed the day before, his face grim. When he returned, dust clinging to his boots, he spoke in a low, clipped tone. They were here, more than once. Not just passing through. They circled. Her mother's. Hands froze around the bread she was slicing. "What does it mean?" "It means they know," he said flatly. His eyes flicked toward Tyan, who sat quietly near the hearth, his bandaged foot resting on a stool. Though his face remained calm, his dark eyes betrayed that he understood. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to defend her choice, to insist that kindness couldn't bring harm. But her voice caught in her chest. She looked at Tyan, and though he didn't say a word, she read the fear in his silence. The day stretched long, the hours heavy with waiting. Clara tried to busy herself with chores, but her ears strained constantly for sounds beyond the cabin. She carried water from the creek, her small hands trembling as she splashed it into the pail. Each rustle in the grass made her whip her head around, expecting riders to burst through. It was late in the afternoon when she saw it. First came the faint dust rising far on the horizon. At first, she thought it was just the wind kicking up, the prairie earth. But then the dust grew thicker, rolling like a wave, and shapes began to form within it. Riders. Her heart dropped into her stomach. "Papa!" she cried, running toward the cabin, the pail sloshing water across her feet. "They're coming!" Her father stepped out instantly, his face turning pale as he followed her gaze. Against the golden light of the setting sun, the riders were unmistakable. Dozens of them, their figures growing larger with each heartbeat. "Inside," he ordered, his voice tight. Clara obeyed, darting into the cabin. Her mother had already gathered what few belongings lay scattered: a loaf of bread, a quilt, the old rifle her father kept by the hearth. Tyan sat stiffly, his hand gripping the arm of the bench. His eyes locked with Clara's, and in them, she saw no surprise, only the quiet certainty of someone who had expected this moment. The ground began to tremble with the thunder of hooves. The chickens scattered, flapping wildly, and the mule brayed in panic. Dust filled the air, choking the sky until the sun seemed to fade. Clara pressed herself against the wall, clutching Tyan's hand. Her mother's breath came quick and sharp. While her father stood tall at the doorway, the rifle gripped tightly in his hands, though he knew it would do little against so many. The riders slowed as they neared the clearing. The dust began to settle, revealing them clearly at last. Warriors, strong and stern, their horses sleek and restless beneath them. There were so many, at least 40, arrayed in a silent line. The sun gleamed against their weapons, though none were yet raised. Their faces were unreadable, watching the small cabin with eyes as sharp as flint. The world seemed to hold its breath. No bird sang, no wind stirred. Only the sound of the horses, pawing the earth, filled the silence. Clara's father raised the rifle slightly, his jaw set, but her mother grabbed his arm. "Don't!" she whispered fiercely. "Don't you dare!" Inside, Clara's heart raced so fast it hurt. She could feel Tyan's hand trembling in hers, though his face stayed calm. He glanced at her, then at the door, as if telling her silently, "This is for me." The warriors dismounted, their movements precise and deliberate. Dust swirled around their feet as they approached the cabin. Each step sounded louder than the last, echoing in Clara's ears. Then came the knock, firm, heavy, final. The sound reverberated through the small cabin like a drumbeat. Her mother flinched. Her father's knuckles whitened around the rifle. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "They're here," she whispered, her voice barely more than a thread. And for the first time, she realized her act of kindness had carried her family to the edge of a moment that would decide everything: their safety, their lives, their place in this vast divided prairie. The sound of the knock seemed to rattle the very bones of the cabin. It wasn't frantic, nor cruel. It was deliberate, steady, a warning and a command all at once. Clara froze where she stood, her hand still clasped tightly around Tyan's. Her father stood rigid at the doorway, the rifle trembling ever so slightly in his grip. His breath was heavy, his eyes darting between the wood of the door and his wife. Her mother shook her head fiercely, whispering, "Don't raise it. For God's sake, don't raise it. That many men out there? A single shot and we're gone." Another knock came, heavier than the first. The door shuddered in its frame. Clara's mother pulled her close, her hands gripping her shoulders. "Stay back," she ordered, her voice tight with fear. But Clara's eyes moved to Tyan. He sat upright on the bench, his face pale, his dark eyes wide with something deeper than fear. Acceptance. He knew, she realized, that they were not here for her family. They were here for him. Clara swallowed hard. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each thud echoing in her ears like the distant rhythm of drums. She thought of the day. She found him on the road, the limp, the blood, the way he had tried to walk alone. She thought of the strip of her dress wrapped around his foot, of the bread they had shared, of the small, fleeting smile he had given her when she hummed her lullaby. She could not let them take him like this, not as if he were some guilty secret hidden behind her family's walls. Another knock boomed. The cabin seemed smaller now, shrinking under the weight of 40 men waiting outside. And then, before fear could choke her into stillness, Clara's small voice broke the silence. "They're here for him," she whispered. Her parents turned sharply toward her. "Clara?" her father began, but she stepped forward, pulling Tyon gently to his feet. He leaned heavily on her, his bandaged foot dragging slightly against the floor, but he did not resist. Her mother's eyes widened. "Child, what are you doing?" Clara lifted her chin, though her knees shook. "If they've come for him, then I'll bring him to them. They need to see." Her father's face darkened, torn between fury and fear. "You'll not open that door." Clara met his gaze, her small hand trembling as it clutched Tyon's. "If we hide, they'll think we're afraid. If we hide, they'll think we meant to steal him away." Her father faltered, the rifle lowering slightly. For all his strength, he knew his daughter spoke truth. The knock came again, this time followed by silence, long and expectant. The warriors outside were waiting. Clara's small frame moved toward the door. Each step felt impossibly heavy, but she pressed on. Tyon walked beside her, leaning into her shoulder, his weight slowing her but not stopping her. Her mother whispered sharply, "Clara, no!" But Clara didn't stop. She reached the door and placed her free hand against the rough wood. She glanced back at her parents. Her father's face was pale, his lips tight. Her mother's eyes shone with fear and unshed tears. Yet neither moved to stop her. Taking a shaky breath, Clara lifted the latch. The door creaked open slowly, the light of dusk spilling into the cabin. And there they were, dozens of warriors, their faces shadowed beneath the setting sun. They stood tall, silent, their horses restless behind them. At their front, a towering elder gazed down at her, his eyes sharp and unyielding. The sight nearly stole the breath from her lungs. But Clara did not step back. She tightened her hold on Tyon's hand and guided him forward until the two of them stood framed in the doorway. The elder's gaze shifted from her to Tyon. His eyes lingered on the boy's bandaged foot, then returned to Clara. He said nothing, yet the silence carried the weight of judgment. Clara swallowed, her voice barely more than a whisper. "He was hurt. I helped him." Tyon looked up at the elder, then back at Clara. His lips moved, and in a low voice he spoke a single word in his own tongue. Clara didn't know its meaning, but she knew its weight. He was naming her, calling her something important. The elder's eyes narrowed slightly, then softened. The silence stretched on, heavy as stone, before one by one, the warriors lowered their weapons. Behind her, Clara's parents stood frozen. But Clara did not see them. She stood small and trembling in the doorway, holding Tyon's hand, her, chin lifted just enough to show she would not hide her choice. She had opened the door to her fear and to her fate. The air outside the cabin was thick with silence. The warriors stood like carved stone, their eyes fixed on the little girl and the injured boy she held upright. Clara could feel their stares pressing down on her tiny shoulders, but she didn't let go of Tyon's hand. She wouldn't. The elder, At the front was taller than she had imagined, his long braids streaked with gray, his face weathered like the bark of an ancient tree. His chest was bare, save for a beaded sash, and his eyes burned with the weight of authority. He raised his hand, palm out, and the rest of the warriors stayed perfectly still. Clara's father, still inside, gripped the rifle but did not raise it. He stood half-hidden behind the doorframe, ready yet hesitant, knowing one wrong move could mean ruin. Her mother clutched at her apron, whispering prayers under her breath, her lips pale as chalk. The elder's gaze shifted downward, landing on Tayan. The boy straightened as much as his weak body would allow, leaning on Clara for balance. His eyes did not waver, though his lips trembled. He muttered something in his own tongue, words Clara couldn't understand but felt in her bones. The elder nodded once, then turned his attention fully upon Clara. His expression was unreadable. To him, she must have seemed impossibly small, a pale-haired wisp of a girl standing between her family's cabin and 40 armed men. Yet there was no fear in her stance, only trembling courage. "You," the elder spoke at last, his voice low, his English broken but clear enough. "You give care to my child." Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry. She nodded, her hand clutching Tayan's tighter. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice wavering. He was hurt. He needed help. The elder tilted his head, studying her. "You afraid?" he asked. Clara glanced up at the towering line of warriors, their painted faces stern, their hands resting on bows, spears, and knives. Then she looked back at Tayan, who leaned so heavily into her she could feel his heartbeat against her arm. Finally, she shook her head. "Not of him," she said softly. "Not of kindness." A murmur rippled through the warriors. Some exchanged glances, others frowned. The elder lifted his hand again, and silence fell. His eyes never left Clara. "You share food?" he asked, his tone sharper now. "Yes," Clara admitted. "Bread and water. You give cloth." His gaze dropped to the bandage on Tayan's foot, once a strip of Clara's own dress. "Yes," she whispered again. The elder stepped closer. The ground seemed to tremble with his weight, or perhaps it was simply Clara's knees threatening to buckle. He loomed over her, his shadow spilling across the threshold of the cabin. Clara could smell the smoke of campfires on his skin, the faint scent of horse and earth. "You..." "Small," he said finally, almost to himself. His eyes softened, just a fraction. "But heart, not small." Clara's chest swelled with a strange heat. Fear and pride mingled together. She didn't know what to say, so she stood silent, clutching Tayan's hand until her knuckles turned white. Then, in one swift motion, the elder turned his head and spoke in his own tongue. His voice boomed across the still evening, sharp and commanding. The warriors stirred at last, their weapons lowered. A few even let out a sound that was neither laughter nor threat. It was something in between, an acknowledgement. Tayan squeezed Clara's hand and whispered in a hoarse voice, "He say, you brave. He say, you kin." Clara blinked, the words sinking into her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Kin. She barely understood its full weight, but she knew it meant belonging. It meant acceptance. The elder lowered his gaze, once more. "Child," he said to Clara, "you show honor. Our people. Remember." Clara's father stepped forward then, unable to remain silent. "She's just a girl," he said gruffly, his voice betraying his unease. "We meant no offense. She only did what she thought was right." The elder's sharp eyes flicked to him. For a tense moment, the world seemed to pause. But then, with surprising gentleness, the elder gave the smallest nod. "No offense. he repeated slowly. Gift. He turned back to Clara. Your hands heal. Your spirit, strong. This boy live because you. Clara's throat tightened. She didn't know whether to cry or to bow her head. Instead, she did the only thing she could. She gave a small, shy smile. The elder raised his hand once more, and the warriors behind him shifted, as if waiting for his final command. The judgment was not yet finished, but the air had changed, no longer thick with threat, but heavy with recognition. Clara realized then. Her choice to help Tyon had not just been seen, it had been measured, and now her fate, and perhaps her family's, rested on what these warriors decided to do next. The night sky deepened into indigo, the last hues of sunset fading as stars began to prick the horizon. The warriors had not moved far, their presence still surrounding the cabin like an unbroken wall. The firelight from the hearth spilled out, onto the dirt flickering across faces painted with symbols of strength and memory. Clara stood in the center, still holding tightly to Tyon's hand. The boy leaned against her, his strength failing but his spirit unyielding. Every breath he drew seemed to echo in the silence, and Clara's heart thudded alongside it, steady and small but unafraid. The elder had not spoken again. He paced slowly. Before her, each footfall deliberate, his eyes never leaving the pale-haired girl who had defied fear to show kindness. He was not only deciding her fate, he was weighing what it meant for two worlds that had never truly trusted one another. At last, he stopped. His gaze swept over the gathered warriors. He spoke in their tongue, his words deep and commanding. Clara did not understand, but the shift in the men's postures told her the decision was coming. Her father tightened his grip on the rifle inside the doorway. His lips parted as though to speak, but her mother clutched his arm and shook her head sharply. This was no moment for guns, no moment for fire. One wrong sound could undo all that Clara's little act had built. The elder turned back to her. He stepped closer and crouched low so that his face was level with hers. His eyes were dark and searching, reflecting the firelight. For a heartbeat, Clara thought he might be angry. But then his voice came low, steady, almost solemn. You give life to one of ours, he said. We give life to yours. Clara frowned, unsure if she understood. She blinked up at him, clutching Tyon's hand tighter. I only wanted to help, she whispered. The elder's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite sternness. He placed his large hand gently over hers, the one holding the boy's. His palm was rough, warm, steady. Help is strongest gift, stronger than war, stronger than fear. He rose to his full height, towering once more. With a sweeping gesture, he called to his warriors. At once, they began to move. Clara tensed, thinking the storm had finally broken. But no war cries came, no weapons were raised. Instead, they shifted into a loose circle, their formation no longer a cage but a shield. Tyon murmured weakly, They honor you. The elder raised his hand again, and the circle stilled. You are kin, he declared in his heavy voice, his words meant for Clara, but carried loud enough for all to hear. This house, safe. This child, honored. From this night, you walk not alone. Clara's heart swelled, her eyes burning with tears she tried to hold back. She did not know if she had earned such a title, but the weight of it settled over her like a mantle she could never forget. Her father finally stepped outside, lowering the rifle to his side. He looked bewildered, his eyes darting between the warriors and his daughter. What? What does this mean? He asked, his voice careful. The elder's gaze shifted to him, stern but not hostile. Your daughter has spirit. She give without fear. We do not forget. His eyes hardened slightly. But remember, gift goes both ways. You harm one of ours, you break this bond. The warning was clear, sharp as a blade. Clara's father nodded stiffly, the rifle hanging heavy in his hands. He looked down at Clara, at the tiny figure who had just brokered peace in a way he never could. Clara's mother stepped out too, her apron still twisted in her hands, tears streaking her cheeks. She put an arm around her daughter's shoulders, pulling her close. "She has always had a big heart," she whispered, almost apologetically. The elder studied the family a moment longer, then gave a single, powerful nod. With that, he spoke again in his own tongue, and the warriors began to disperse into the darkness. Their presence melted into the night, shadows becoming part of the land once more. Only a few lingered, young men who lifted Tyan gently into their arms. Clara reached out instinctively, afraid they were taking him away, but Tyan gave her a faint smile, his hand slipping free from hers with a squeeze. "I go home," he whispered, "but I carry you with me." Her chest tightened, a mixture of relief and sorrow flooding her. She wanted to beg them not to take him, to let her care for him longer. But she knew. He belonged to them, to his people. She was only the one who had kept him alive long enough to return. The elder looked back one final time, his eyes resting on Clara. "Child," he said, his voice resonant with gravity, "you change what many men cannot." Then he was gone, striding into the night, his people flowing behind him. Clara stood at the doorway of her cabin, her small hand still outstretched toward the fading figures. The land felt different now, wider, deeper, bound to her in ways she could not yet name. She had offered bread, water, and cloth. In return, she had been given something far greater: trust, respect, kinship. And though the night was quiet once, Clara knew in her heart that nothing would ever be the same. The dawn came softly, as if the earth itself was reluctant to disturb the silence left behind by the warriors' departure. Mist clung to the fields, curling low around the fence posts, and the cabin sat in quiet stillness. Only the faint smoke from the chimney whispered that life stirred within. Clara sat at the small wooden table, her bare feet tucked beneath her, her chin resting on the palms of her hands. Her eyes had not left the window all morning. Beyond the fog, the trail where the warriors had vanished stretched empty. No footprints remained, no broken branches, as if the night before had been a dream woven from starlight and fire. Yet Clara knew it was real. Her hands still carried the warmth of Tyan's fingers. Her heart still echoed with the elder's words. "You change what many men cannot." Her father moved about the room, restless, checking and rechecking the rifle he had leaned against, the wall. His brows were furrowed, his mouth drawn into a tight line. He wasn't angry, not exactly, but troubled, as though he struggled to grasp the meaning of what had transpired. Her mother worked at the hearth, spooning porridge into bowls. Her movements were quiet, thoughtful, her shoulders less tense than the night before. From time to time, she glanced at Clara, her eyes soft, almost proud. Finally, her father broke the silence. "I still don't understand how we'll explain this," he muttered, half to himself. 40 warriors at our door, and not a shot fired." Clara turned to him, her voice steady despite her smallness. "Because there didn't need to be." He paused, rifle in hand, and looked at her. She held his gaze with a calmness far beyond her years. "They came because Tyan needed help," she continued. "And I helped him, that's all. Sometimes people just need to be seen." Her words struck him like a hammer against stone. He opened his mouth to argue, but found nothing to say. Instead, he lowered the rifle back to its place by the door and sank into the chair opposite her. "You're braver than most men I've known," he said finally, his voice rough, almost ashamed. Clara tilted her head. "It wasn't brave. It was just right." Her mother set a bowl before her, smiling faintly at the exchange. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the simplest kindness is the hardest thing for grown men to see." The day moved on. Clara helped with chores, feeding the chickens, fetching water, sweeping the small porch, but every task seemed lighter, as though the air itself carried a hidden promise. And though the warriors were gone, she did not feel abandoned. She felt watched over, the way the land itself seemed to bend closer as if listening. Weeks passed. The memory of that night did not fade. It deepened. From time to time, Clara found small signs left at the edge of the woods, a bundle of herbs bound with leather string, a carved feather left resting on the fence post, once even a necklace of beads so fine she could only marvel at it. Gifts, she realized, tokens of remembrance, of bond. Her parents were wary, but they did not forbid her from keeping them. Somewhere in their hearts, they too began to understand. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, her father sat beside her on the porch. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "Do you think they'll come back?" Clara hugged her knees, watching the fireflies rise from the grass. "They don't need to," she answered. "They already left something behind." He frowned slightly. "What's that?" She pressed a hand against her chest where her heart beat steady and true. "A promise." Her father said nothing more. But when he looked at her, there was no rifle between them, no barrier of doubt. Only recognition that his little girl had carried them all into something larger than fear. Years would pass, and Clara would grow. She would remember the boy whose hand she once held, and the circle of warriors who came to her door not with anger, but with respect. She would carry their gifts, their warning, their trust. And in the quiet moments when the wind rustled the tall grass or the stars shone sharp in the night sky, she would know they were near, that her small act had stitched a thread between two worlds that would not break. For though she was just a little girl who once offered bread and cloth to a hurt child, the story of that night would echo across both cabins and camps. Warriors would speak of her as the child with a heart of fire, and settlers would whisper of the night. 40 warriors came, not to take, not to burn, but to honor. And Clara, with her gentle hands and steadfast spirit, would live forever in the memory of both peoples as proof that kindness, even the smallest kind, could change the course of many lives.